Franklin Morris Howarth was one of the earliest published American cartoonists and comic strip artists, and although exceptionally popular at the time, now he's somehow managed to become one of the least well known. He was born in Philadelphia in 1864, and with no formal art training, by the age of 19 he was getting his work published in several newspapers in the city. Soon after, he began working for national humour magazines such as Life, Judge and Truth. He joined the staff of Puck magazine in 1891, and they became his primary but not exclusive vehicle of expression for the next 10 years or so. Very quickly he gravitated to creating characters with big heads on little bodies. He never involved himself with dialogue in speech balloons, and his strips were accompanied instead by panels of narrative text. His line work was his greatest strength, and it was remarkably clean and calligraphic. And although he did make use of light hatching techniques, he did so with restraint, and left large areas of his images quite open and minimal. In 1899 his collection of mostly colour comic strips titled Funny Folks was published in both the USA and Britain, and this book brought him much greater recognition. Arguably the success of this volume led to interest from William Randolph Hearst publishing empire, and in 1902 Howarth signed a contract for his work to be widely syndicated across the USA. Among his early popular strips was an ongoing humorous account of the ups and downs of courtship, the love of Lulu and Leander, created in 1902 for the New York American. He enjoyed similar success with Mr. E.Z. Mark, which was first published in the American Journal Examiner in 1903. As the name suggests, in every episode the central character was fleeced in all manner of ways by a variety of con tricks. And this strip had a run of 5 years before the public tired of the same gag. In 1906 Howarth created The Lad That Loved a Lady, which also ran as A Lad and His Lass, but it was simply a rerun of his earlier Lulu and Leander strip with a medieval setting, and only managed a run of a year. He also created the strip Ol Opie Dildock in 1907, which became arguably his most successful and certainly longest running strip. But with one of life's terrible ironies, it wasn't Howarth who benefited from its success. Unfortunately, in 1908 he fell ill with pneumonia, and he died soon after at the age of only 43. But the strip lived on, subsequently drawn by W. L. Wells, and it continued to be published up to 1914. Edward Penfield was born just 2 years later than Howarth in 1866 in Brooklyn, New York, and in his early 20s he enrolled at the city's Art Students' League. In 1890, at the age of 24, he was offered a job as an art editor and illustrator with Harper's Magazine. And in 1893 he designed the first of what would be a large series of monthly posters for the magazine. This series of striking gestural graphic images, which were created as lithographs, owed an obvious debt to the work of French poster artists, particularly that of Toulouse-Lautrec and Théophile Steinlen. And compared to the work of others in the USA at that time, they were considered to be daringly modernist. Penfield claimed, not very credibly, to have been unaware of the work of the French poster artists, despite the fact that only a year earlier he'd visited Paris for an extended study tour. But whether the similarity was coincidental or not, his images came to be inextricably tied to the magazine's visual identity. And despite his full-time job with Harper's, he also found time to take other commissions for book illustration and other magazines and advertising work during this period of his career. In 1897 he married, and the couple set up home in New York, where he created a studio in the top floor of the house. By the turn of the century, Penfield was working at Harper's in multiple roles, as art director, manager, editor and artist. But in 1901 he decided to devote his time entirely to illustration. In addition to his ongoing advertising work, he forged new relationships with other magazines, including the Saturday Evening Post, and most significantly Collier's. All his cover work for Collier's continued to be influenced by the French poster artists and increasingly the work of Japanese woodblock printmakers, and by now his linear style was becoming significantly heavier. He was a keen traveller, and following a trip to the Netherlands he wrote and drew a series of articles based on his travels, which was also published in 1907 in book form as Holland Sketches. And after a few years back in the USA, he returned to Europe and travelled around Spain, which resulted in 1911's equally successful Spanish Sketches. In addition to his enduring career as an illustrator, he also taught part-time at the Art Students League, and when America entered World War I, he created a series of dramatically composed domestic propaganda posters. Following the war, there was no sign of Penfield becoming less popular, and he continued to be prolific, creating yet more posters and other advertising work alongside his regular work for Collier's. But tragically in 1924 he injured his back in a fall, which rendered him unable to work, and only a year later he died from complications at the age of only 59. In Germany, illustrator Heinrich Vogel is respected enough to merit his own museum, but elsewhere I think he's largely unknown. Vogler was born in Bremen in 1872, and in 1890, at the age of 18, he enrolled at the Dusseldorf Art Academy. In 1894, with his studies behind him, he moved to an artist colony in Worpswede in rural Saxony. There he created limited editions of his etchings, but only with limited success. But by 1897 he was also creating more commercial work, including page decorations for The Emperor and the Witch by Hugo von Hofmannsthal. In 1898 he illustrated The Sunken Bell, written by Gerhard Hauptmann, and a year later he moved to Munich, where there were many more publishers and correspondingly more opportunities for commissions. Among his new clients was the arts magazine Jugend, for whom he created covers and page illustrations, and he was much in demand as an illustrator of books for both adults and children. He had particular success with his imaginatively illustrated and decorated colour edition of the Tales of the Brothers Grimm in 1907, featuring fine line work and sensitive use of colour washes. But he continued to be diverse in his creative pursuits, and in addition to his ongoing work as an artist and illustrator, he was simultaneously working as a furniture designer in a workshop with his brother, and even turned his hand to several architectural projects. In 1911 he also created a series of line drawings to illustrate an edition of Oscar Wilde's story The Happy Prince. And although it was a monochrome project, he once again used his pictorial, expressive and decorative skills to bring the narrative to life. During the Great War, Vogeler fought and was injured in battle, and the horrors he witnessed led him to publish an open letter to Kaiser Wilhelm, pleading with him to surrender so that peace could be restored. This didn't go down too well, and he was sent to a mental hospital. When he was subsequently released, he became even more openly dissident and was imprisoned, although only briefly. At which point he set up his own commune and art school in Bakenhof, which occupied much of his time and energy. In 1923 he visited the Soviet Union, and when he returned to Germany he joined the KPD, the German Communist Party of the time. By 1927 his career had taken a downward turn and he was struggling financially, so he worked briefly as a draftsman for an architectural office in Berlin. In 1931 he left for Moscow and took up permanent residence there with his wife, and he created propaganda aimed against the Nazi dictatorship in Germany alongside his now more expressionistic painting and printmaking. But after the German invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, he was deported to Kazakhstan by the Soviet authorities, and he died there in 1942 at the age of 70. Ukrainian Nataliya Paran was born Nataliya Chelpanova in Kiev in 1897. In her later teens she studied drawing and painting at the Moscow School of Fine Arts. But the 1917 revolution put an end to that institution, and with no other option she had to continue her studies at the newly established state workshops of Moscow. Once her studies were finished, she taught drawing and art to children for a few years, but this was a long way from the career she'd envisaged for herself. In 1926 she met and married Brice Parain, the cultural attaché of the French embassy in Moscow. And when he returned to Paris in 1928, she was only too glad to go with him. And once they had relocated, she seized the opportunity to find work as an illustrator in the French capital. She found a warm welcome from the publishing houses there, and in 1930 her illustrated edition of the children's book My Cat, written by André Bercler, was published, which quickly became a success in France. And in the same year she published another cat story, Anton Chekhov's Châtain, originally written in 1887. Despite her early determination to get out of Soviet Russia, Parain's style was heavily influenced by Russian constructivist art of the kind created by Malevich and Lebedev for the Bolshevik publishing authorities. Conventional representation was not on her stylistic agenda, and her blend of abstraction and folk art placed her among other early pioneers in children's publishing, who saw no reason to perpetuate the painted, more figurative conventions which had been the norm since the later 1800s. In 1931 she published Je Découpe, and this children's picture book was created using only simple cut-out shapes as collage. And much to the surprise of more traditionally inclined publishers, it enjoyed immense success. Most of her books were for the publisher Flammarion's Père Castor imprint, and she had another major success with her visualization of the Russian folk tale of Baba Yaga, published in 1935. This series of radically modernist narrative images made great use of white space, and combined hand-drawn imagery with cut-out elements. In the same year she published the first of what would become a series of instructional books which actually capitalized on the simplicity of her approach, and demonstrated techniques for creating simple shapes which could nevertheless express narrative meaning. Throughout the 1930s and into the 1940s, Parain's distinctive images were a ubiquitous presence in children's publishing in France, and she enjoyed popularity in other European countries too. Some of her work was cut out, some drawn and painted, and some a combination of both, but all were remarkably inventive and demonstrated the persistence of her creativity. The last published book I've managed to track down is 1948's Les Chiens, and I'm very sorry to have to report that Nataliya Paran was yet another illustrator who didn't get to have an old age, and she died when she was 61 in 1958. And on that even more than usually downbeat note, I bid you goodbye until the next one is uploaded.